So the first thing I have on my list about excited stuff is the Centenarian Olympics, which is my favorite sport. It's the sport that I am exclusively training for, and it has become one of the highest priorities within my medical practice in the past probably 2 years. So the idea is the following. I had this, I think I can call it an epiphany, actually, maybe 18 months ago to 2 years ago. I was at the funeral of a close friend, the parent of a close friend. And like all funerals, there's a somber nature to them, but on some level, people are also generally rejoicing in the fact that a person hasn't suffered too much. And in the case of my friend's parent, who'd been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, the time from diagnosis to death was like 6 months, and everyone was like, "Oh, that's great." There wasn't much suffering there. But I knew that parent for many years. And what I realized in spending more time talking with everybody was that the last 10 years of their life, even though their brain was still intact, shy of the last 6 months of that 10 years, the body had broken down. And the two things that gave that person the pleasure, beyond spending time with their grandkids and things like that, which was golf and gardening, like landscaping, really some killer landscaping, were basically off the table. Courtesy of hip injuries, shoulder injuries, back injuries, all these other things. And so I sort of reflected on this for a while and realized that's pretty much the standard path that people go on, which is before they actually die their physical death, the sort of what I call death certificate death, they tend to die some combination of a cognitive and physical as an exoskeleton death. And so we're sitting there at the funeral, and I'm just thinking there's got to be a way to stop this, because nobody's really thinking about this. We do all this amazing training for athletes who are, trying to go to the Olympics or even being weekend warriors or doing whatever they're going to do. But why aren't we training to be kick-ass 90-year-olds? So my hypothesis was, well, it's just a lack of specificity. I mean, what separates, a professional athlete from a weekend warrior is generally the specificity and the intensity with which they pursue this thing. So I said, well, what if we came up with an event that actually defined what one would want to be able to do when they're 100, using that just as a benchmark. Again, you may never live to 100, but to train to achieve this thing when you're 100, you'll obviously be in great shape when you're 80. And so I sort of came up with this idea of the Centenarian Olympics. And the first thing you got to know about the Centenarian Olympics is it's very personal. It's individual. Everyone will have a set of events. So you and I might have a different looking Centenarian Olympics, though I think there are some common things to all. So the first thing I did to figure this out was for myself, which is, the person I'm solving for in the first iteration, is sort of mapped out how old everyone in my life would be when I'm 100. So how old would my kids be? How old would their kids' be? And all the way down. And that gave me kind of a mental model of what the world looks like when I'm in my 10th decade. And what I realized is the things that are probably going to give me the greatest joy at that stage will involve interacting with those littler people. And my kids won't be that little. They'll be in their 60s or whatever. But their kids will be, in their 20s and 30s. And their kids' will be basically the age of my youngest kids now. And so I just started paying more attention to what I do with them. And it's stuff that, Tim, you and I would take for granted today. In fact, I'm guessing anybody listening to this is going to take it for granted. But kids, you've seen my kids a million times, they play on the floor. So step one, can you get up off the floor? Can you lay on the floor? Can you do something on the floor? And can you get up under your own support? Again, you could do that blindfolded today. But watch how many people, even in their 60s, let alone 70s and 80s, can't do that. And then you start to deconstruct why. What are the structural misgivings that prevent someone from doing that? Another thing I noticed is how often toddlers come running at you head first, and they don't actually stop when they get to you. So there's an implicit assumption that as they're running to you, you're going to be able to pick them up and stop that momentum. And if you can't, you're going to get a headbutt to the groin. So that's a very essential part of the equation here. So I started saying, well, how many times does my son, my youngest son, come running at me, and how often do I have to drop down into a goblet squat, grab him, and pick him up? And so basically, I listed out 18 things that I can do today that I want to be able to do when I'm 90, for example. And those events constitute my centenarian Olympics. And so I'll rattle off a couple of them, but a 30-pound goblet squat. Again, could you do that today, Tim? Yeah, you could do 100 of those today. But how many 90-year-olds can do that? Very few. Walking up 3 flights of stairs with 10 pounds of groceries in each hand and walking down under the same load. Again, biomechanically, that's not a trivial task. The walking down has its own challenges. The walking up has its own challenges. Being able to pull myself out of a pool where the gap between the water and the surface, the lip of the ground is 6 inches away. So being able to actually pull myself up. As I said, getting up off the floor with a single point of support, being able to put a 30-pound suitcase over my head, all these sorts of things.
Which would simulate putting your luggage into the overhead.
Exactly. Again, I would not want to, I don't want to get to the day when I can't put my luggage above myself in the airplane. And once I sort of mapped out all these things, I kind of broke down what the movement patterns that were necessary to do this. So this requires the ability to hip hinge. This requires a certain amount of aerobic efficiency. This requires a certain amount of anaerobic efficiency. This requires a certain amount of scapular stability, et cetera, et cetera. And they basically condense into 4 elements of health, which is stability. So the ability to control using the muscles of the body, control the exoskeleton such that load is transferred safely through muscles as opposed to unsafely out joints. Strength, aerobic efficiency, and anaerobic performance. And then you back out of that and say, well, if you want to be able to do all of those things by the time you're 100 or say in your 10th decade, so between 90 and 100, what do you need to be doing when you're 70? Because there is going to be an inevitable decline from 70 to 100. And if you can do this metric at 70, what do you need to be able to do at 60? And what do you be able to need to do at 50? And, since that's the decade I'm closest to, I'll be 50 soon, that becomes my benchmark is, okay, so that's what I'm training for. And so this idea we've sort of translated to our patients, which is, unless you really have a strong desire to do an Ironman or run a marathon, most people are exercising without a real sense of purpose. And so the question is, could you create a true sense of purpose around this and then work backwards to build towards it? And obviously, we're not going to know the answer to that question until people start getting there. But my strong belief is you can and you should. And if you don't do this, if you just assume by chance you're going to get there, I think the likelihood of that is low.
And if we look at one of those exercises, and you can pick any one, but let's just take the goblet squat. Yeah, goblet squat to simulate picking up a toddler. How do you back out from doing that at 90 or 100 with 30 pounds? Do you assume a certain amount of sarcopenia, is that the right word? Muscle loss per year from 70 to 100, and then somehow calibrate a much higher weight for a certain number of repetitions as a result? How do you think through that calculus?
It's exactly that. So it's not rocket science to figure out a 30-pound goblet squat at 90 equals how many pounds at 50. The bigger question is to understand how you have to do it biomechanically at 50 to ensure you can still even do it safely at 90. So let's just say the number is 90 pounds at 50. It's not that hard to goblet squat 90 pounds for a fit guy like you, but it's actually kind of hard at our age or anybody's age, frankly, to do it perfectly, especially with complete scapular protraction, which is another thing you want to be able to do. Because remember, you're holding a toddler here. So you need to be completely stabilized through the upper and lower body. And the thing that's nice about a goblet squat, just as one example.
Do you want to just describe a goblet squat to people for those who don't know? I mean, we could use a kettlebell as an example or something else.
Yeah. So if you're picturing holding a dumbbell or a kettlebell and you have both hands on it and it's in front of you, and you're going into a squat position that way. So as opposed to like a barbell squat where the bar is on your back and you're holding it back, the nice thing about this goblet squat is it's a little bit more representative of real world movement because you now have your scapula that have to move forward. That's called protraction. And you have to be able to stabilize that position, which is, going to be holding the kettlebell or the dumbbell or the child.
Or if you're our friend Kevin Rose, you want to be able to throw a raccoon at 90. Also helpful for those